All right, good morning to you, because this is Faith Over Breakfast, but for us, it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a Wednesday. This is an abnormal Faith Over lunchtime with no food. And Eric's not here. This is Andy from Mission Church in Tucson, Arizona. I got two of my good friends from Mission, John Simon.
Yep, right here.
And I've got Dr. James Dill.
Hey, y'all.
And we're going into this Rachel Bach story because James here has an experience. He has a background of living in Africa and doing short-term missions, but he's also become an MD, and he is he kind of a unique ability to speak into this. So I thought it was a good discussion. We talked about. I don't know. Tell them what we talked about, John.
You guys just really in for a treat, you know. I don't want to spoil anything. I think the anticipation should just build naturally.
All right, don't check out. If you want to get our most raw thoughts, stick around till the last few seconds. So enjoy. Thanks for tuning in. All right, this is a special edition. Because we're not meeting on a Tuesday. We're not meeting in the morning. We're not having Faith Over Breakfast at all. In fact, this is a part 2 of potentially the last podcast you heard, where Eric and I were talking about especially the white privilege. We talked about the white savior complex, and this kind of came out of an article that I shared with Eric. It had to do with a missionary who was accused of having a white savior complex, who's been in the news recently, Rachel Bach. So today, there are two people here. Eric is not. He's not available today, so I've got two people here. I wanted to follow up on this conversation about Rachel from a different perspective, and I've got John Simon.
Medical professional,
Dr. John Simon.
Dr. John Simon, hey.
John,
happy to be here.
John is a member and staff member these days at Mission Church with me, and he and I are normally having breakfast with Nick, our co-pastor, right now.
Yep.
Nick's gone, lunch we would normally be having, and so we were available, and we got our buddy James Dill.
Hi. How's everybody doing?
We're doing well, thank you.
Yeah,
and everybody else is responding to you. Let's give them a second to respond.
I know
to
they're out there.
Yeah,
they're happy.
And James, and you can correct me on this, but James, the reason I wanted to talk to you, James, is because of your background in missions. You've done short-term missions. You've lived in Africa with your family there, so you have a missions background that has some similarity to the subject of these articles. And then you went to school to become a medical doctor. So, and you're doing sports medicine at the University of Arizona right now.
Yeah, so I
did pediatrics for a bit before this.
Right, yeah, I did a combined residency, so I lost my mind and I did 2 residencies at the same time. So I did emergency medicine and pediatrics both. Yeah. And then finished those last year, and I'm doing a sports medicine fellowship at University of Arizona.
Yeah, so I just thought, how many people doing a podcast on this have at their disposal somebody who can relate to both sides of this very, very debate. So, first off, just to kick it away from you for a second, I want to know what John Simon thinks. Like, what's your takeaway? What questions do you have for a guy like, Dr. Dill? We're not used to saying that because we're friends.
They just say that guy over there.
That guy over there. But yeah, when you read and saw stuff about, NPR covered, a lot of different news organizations covered this missionary and the 105 children that died under her organization's care in Uganda over a decade. But how, what's your response to this, and what were you wrestling with as somebody who's not in the medical field?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. I think that so NPR, and we kind of discussed this in the Facebook comment section when you posted this, was that, there are some people who are concerned that NPR is going to have more of more like kind of left
I'm instructing John on his microphone. John, don't talk into the top of your mic.
I'm sorry. I think I'm good now, aren't I?
You're better.
All right, I'm better. All right, sorry about that, guys. 100 people just like, man, can't even hear this guy.
We lost him.
And
Eric doesn't edit this podcast, so you're gonna hear it all.
No, I feel like a big accusation that, because I remember the last time I remember a story blowing up this big, like in a mainstream story, was the young dude from California,
John Chow.
Yeah, yep. North Sentinelese Islands, north of India.
North Sentinel Island.
That's right.
And right. Eric and I did discuss that on this podcast,
right,
as well. Yeah, that's the most recent.
And so,
American missionary, not white, but American missionary story. Yeah.
Right, and it seems like a big narrative that people that especially like I guess Christians tend to gloss over it and romanticize these stories, which I feel like also does an injustice. But I feel like another thing that's happening on the opposite side of the spectrum is that missionaries are being portrayed as these really reckless, uninformed people who just have a gospel in their heart that they just want to sing, with no regard for safety and well-being, or some regard, like good intention, but no actual resources. And that's kind of the narrative that's being painted about missionaries, especially Western, specifically American missionaries. So James, like with your experience, I'd really like to see like how you would entertain that thought that narrative's kind of being passed along right now.
Yeah, so just for everyone listening, so just a little tiny bit about my background. So when I first lived overseas, it was for a year in Cameroon, Africa, back in 1997, at a hospital that had been built in the extreme North Province. And the people that were living there when I'd gone there had been there since like the late 80s. The hospital is still around to this day. So my experience we'll just use the word missions. My experience with missions was that you made a decision to go over to a place and dedicate yourself to that. So my initial experience with missions was that like you spent time living with the people you were with, understanding their culture, with the framework of mind that you are not like a native to their culture and that you need to respect that. However, on the flip side, my first experience with people who just went over to do something and ended up making things worse was actually not with Christians. It was with, I remember a group of someone who was with like a nonprofit organization like Greenpeace. We were in a really remote village and they got super sick because they didn't know how to function in a very rural African environment. And I remember my interaction with them, but this is back in 1997. Since then, if you have come back from living in that area and then you watch like movies and things like that, you always see the missionary portrayed as like the high water pantsed white guy with a bald head and glasses who kind of sternly looks at everybody and has complete ignorance of anyone else's culture. And that was not my experience. I remember thinking at a young age, like, oh, like these people are just like, I don't think they know what they're doing, because the people I was with could speak the language, they knew the culture, they knew all this stuff, and they were been accepted by the people that they were with, not as like members of their culture, but because of what they were doing. And so the hospital that I was living at was really well respected, not just in northern Cameroon, but in Nigeria and Chad as well. And people would send. But I mean, on the flip side, comparing it to the article that we read, this group of people that I worked with, they were extremely well trained. Like even after my own medical training, these are some of the doctors that I knew and ended up working with later. Some of the smartest people that I've ever, just their resourcefulness, their love of the people they were working with, and their medical training. It was impressive, even in retrospect. So,
yeah. So, I saw the article first just by myself, and here's where I first went with it. I went with just to kind of couple this onto John's questions, I guess. Like my first, I had maybe a defensive reaction as a Christian I think I've had my qualms with missions and how it's been done, but generally I'm for it. And so I saw the article and I was like, hold on, like I don't know if we have all the right information here, and like who, I had some, I kind of, in my own mind, kind of came to this person's defense a little bit. And then I went home and talked to my wife, who is a medical professional as well as a nurse. And she was really struck, and she was like bothered. She was like, that's not how you practice, and so, yeah, you've had those experiences. And then I guess coming from your experiences, seeing this article I sent to you, how did it land with you?
Yeah, so reading it, I can see her, and granted, I don't know her. Don't know her story, and I want to, for myself, avoid speaking to her like her heart, and the state of her soul and all that stuff.
Same.
So, however, just kind of as a category, like I have known people like that, where and the people that I've known, like they genuinely want to help.
Agreed. Yeah.
However, I think there is putting a name on it is kind of hard, and I think there are a bunch of things that kind of cause it. But my first kind of reaction to it, kind of knowing what I know about, because we also have worked in Malawi with acutely malnourished kids and taking care of kids who usually in our context in the Western culture, it's not really going to be so much. We see like poverty-associated acute malnutrition here, but it's mostly, I've seen it from the context of like anorexia, where someone puts it onto themselves to not take in adequate calories. So, but seeing her do that, like, I know she, like, you can tell that she genuinely wants to help the people, but like there's this element of what I sense, and as I'm reading it, I'm like, man, like, you're doing this all wrong. Part of the article commented on most of the kids, a lot of them died within, like, I think they said 2 days when she initiated treatment.
Right.
Yeah, so that's probably like you can get what's called like refeeding syndrome, and it reminded me a lot of, if you all saw the last episode of Chernobyl, where they explained. Did you all see this?
No.
Oh God, you need to go watch Chernobyl.
I'm glad you did.
Yeah, it's great. Anyway, it's sort of like a reactor meltdown.
Yeah, I know about Chernobyl, but yeah.
So go watch the last episode of Chernobyl, and that's essentially what refeeding syndrome is when they're.
It doesn't sound good. It doesn't sound positive.
It's a meltdown, and then you die.
Yeah.
So it's so complicated to try and determine, like, what do you, to go over and do something, like, what is adequate preparedness, and like, but she mentioned at one point, this is one thing that struck me in the article, she mentioned at one point, I'm writing this story to try, and I realize in retrospect that it's a lot of like, kind of like my pride.
Right.
And I was like, aha, see, that's it. So there is, I think, an understanding of like, we can save the world, we can do all this stuff, and I'm not the greatest fan of like a lot of how we interpret reality through mass media. And so I think it's that idea of she's probably coming from a culture where we are used to two separate realities, the one that we live out and the one that we present through the internet. And so she's writing this blog that makes her appear to be someone that she's not. And so I think that's a lot of the problem with some of the people that I've met, is they're searching to create their identity in these contexts.
Yeah.
From the people that I met through like these non-Christian NGOs who go to do this, to this girl who is trying to save kids. In one form or fashion, it's like trying to create your identity and to kind of prove that maybe that you're good enough and that you're doing something meaningful in the world. And the drive to do that can be destructive. And I think that's what I'm seeing when I read the article.
So I looked at a lot of different comments that, I didn't try to read them all, but I was just trying to get a sense of how people are responding to this, and it's all over the map.
Yeah.
But if you could, I guess let's imagine somebody, the people who are commenting, look, it's another example of white colonial garbage.
Mm-hmm.
This is just pure stupidity. It all needs to stop. This is evangelical white colonialism. If somebody were sitting, if I were sitting in this room and I said that to you, from your experience and background, how would you respond to that?
Sure. Let's see. There are so many different ways that I respond to that. First of all, I totally get it.
Yeah.
Long story, so I won't go into them. But, I mean, just when I hear the phrase, like, white colonialism and the effects that it can have especially, and, like, my context is mostly Africa. I've spent some time in Afghanistan, China, and India as well, but most of my time has been spent in sub-Saharan Africa, both east and west. And I have totally seen the effects from non-religious and religious sides of that white colonialism, and that, like, our culture has elements that are superior, and so we're going to make sure that we enforce that culture on you or try to get you to join our culture, like that kind of thing. So, like, my first response is that, like, I totally get it, right. And I see it. However, those statements in and of themselves are, to me, are hyperbolic. So it's sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I actually had a conversation with someone the other day when I was I was in Tanzania teaching English back before medical school, and there's a situation where someone was going to be killed. They were a thief. They were going to burn this guy alive, and I tried to intervene. Long story short is that there was a big misunderstanding, and so they decided to burn me alive.
Oh,
yeah, it didn't happen. I'm not dead. But the conversation I had with this guy was like, well, why didn't, if things would have been, because the guy ended up living anyway, and he was like, well, why didn't you just not do anything? Because if you had not done anything, then it would have been better. And so I think there's kind of that attitude as well, where it's like, okay, so having been in these contexts before, where you know that if someone doesn't show up and doesn't intervene, people will suffer and people will die. So not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so the complication is, how do you determine how to, because if anyone is going, religious or not, if anyone's going to go and live in sub-Saharan Africa, they're not doing it for their health. Like, they're doing it because they have a moral standard that they're living by that calls them to go to help other people. So
and that might be attached to God or a belief in human rights,
right.
Or
it could be humanism, it could be all sorts of stuff. Everyone's got their reason. They just like end up there. So determining how do you, because I don't think it's wrong to follow your beliefs and when you're doing it consistently. So how do you follow your beliefs consistently in a way that is going to help people and not harm their culture or make their culture worse or enforce your own culture on them? And I think from the people that I've worked with and from talking to people that have been in missions since probably the mid-'80s, that's kind of when that kind of cultural change in mission started, where it went from being kind of the compound mentality, where you absorb people into your compound and you kind of make them part of the Western culture, right, versus the sort of going there with the idea of trying your best to incorporate yourself into their culture and understand them and love them in their culture without changing the things that are supposed to stay intact. Because when you look at the Bible, it's not talking, the gospel should be something that transcends culture. And so one thing that in the context of culture,
explains that to somebody who doesn't have a biblical background.
Totally.
Yeah.
So fundamentally, what the gospel is intending to do, and the gospel being the good news, that when God created the world, he intended it for a certain purpose, for it to be good and for it to be beautiful and to bring glory to him. And he wanted mankind to join him in that and participate in that. But through our decisions, we lost that. And then God sent his son, Jesus, to die for our sins and to redeem the world and to bring his kingdom, which basically means that through his sacrifice, he set up a way for us to be able to join God again, to be able to see a redeemed world and to participate in that with him.
And how does that transcend culture, and what do you mean by that?
Sure, yeah. So originally, culture in and of itself, when you look at, how people interact with each other, it's not, and the beliefs that they hold, it's not necessarily immoral or moral. They can be morally neutral or immoral or immoral. Some cultures think, like one culture that I was in Afghanistan, part of the culture was that honor killings are a good thing. I knew one guy who had killed his sister because she was raped. Right. And I would not consider that a moral action, like that's immoral. But the other thing, elements of culture are not, they can be good or they can be sort of morally neutral. So for the gospel to transcend culture, basically what that means is for people to accept the sacrifice of Jesus and what he did and his bring the world back into kind of an upright stance where it's bringing glory to God and people are in a relationship of community and love with each other. I don't know many people that would disagree with that being a good thing. And then kind of going back into the structure of the kind of the universe being righted. So for people to accept that, it doesn't take away from or it shouldn't when it's being done right. It doesn't take away from the good parts of the culture that are supposed to stay. So an example would be sort of if you went back to follow maybe like the Baptists in the like 1970s or 80s, if they went to an African culture, dance is a big part of African culture.
Right.
Not like dirty dancing, but like, it's like community dancing.
They weren't twerking.
Right. We invented that. That's not So like their temptation, probably a lot of people would do this back in that day, would be to say, okay, well, all dancing, we don't dance at all. So we're going to remove that from your culture. And so that if you're really genuinely looking at Scripture says nothing about that. Like for people to line dance is not like a sin. So that is something that's beautiful about a culture that would stay. However, in reference to like the culture I lived in Afghanistan, like they had beautiful parts of their culture. But honor killings obviously is not something that is bringing glory to God. So those things
or
about
loving your neighbor.
Right, totally, or loving your neighbor. And those things dissolve away in the context of the gospel, loving the Lord with all your heart, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself in the light of Christ's sacrifice for us. So those things sort of fall away. And then when you look after that, so you can retain and should be able to retain culture with just the simple view of exactly just adopting what Christ did in his sacrifice for us. So I think when people are living in that and trying to focus on loving God and loving their neighbor, it should not be destroying culture. It should be highlighting the things about a culture, because God in the beginning, I think, he is responsible for the beautiful things in culture, and we are created in his image, and the things that we come up with that are good and beautiful are reflections of him. And so those things should not be lost, and those things are elements of culture.
And then the culmination at the end of the scriptural narrative is that there is a worshiping community of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, meaning their distinctives are still there. Yeah. At the least, their distinctives are still there. And so that scripturally is a reason to believe that cultures shouldn't be obliterated and made monolithic or whatever. So another way I've heard that described, and this is kind of a Tim Keller thing, which nobody will be surprised who listens that that's where I got it. But a simple way he puts it is that the gospel does not fully affirm or fully condemn any culture. It affirms beautiful things in every culture and condemns evil within every culture. So the minute you think that you're in the culture that has it all right, well, you don't see it. Right. And if you think another culture ought to be fully condemned and turned into yours, you don't understand it. So if you want to know God, and a God that could be a God over all people and the whole world and every culture, look for one who will affirm something in all of the nooks and crannies of creation, and one who will also say no to every nook and cranny of creation to some degree. And I think, I look and I think to the folks who say this is a white evangelical thing, I think some of the same mistakes have been made by the Peace Corps and so on and so forth. And I would say, like you said, we all are going in with some kind of moral code we're trying to enforce. The question is whose. Right. And so if you're with the Peace Corps, you're enforcing the moral code of the West. Mm-hmm. And that, that's scary. But then you can enforce the moral code of God with a Western layer over it. And you need to be really careful with that too.
That's why I think it's important that as Christians who hear these concerns and criticisms from the NPR and from the comment sections, which I'm sure were, pretty aggressively against what this lady did for good reason. Good reason. Right. We recognize that we should be resisting this idea of colonialism because it absolutely is a mindset that people carry here in the West and here in America. I've talked to people who told me that the culture of their church was the gospel. And I'm like, look, the gospel is a great thing to center your church experience around. But if you don't think that there's like a culture in the style of, you know, attire that your church has, and the music that you guys sing, and, you know, a million other factors and things about you, like, you're delusional.
Yeah, I grew up in a culture where, and not to, I'll try and say this in a way that doesn't slide any particular culture, but I grew up in a culture where politics and religion were closely intertwined. And your ability to distinguish those two things almost became, it took growing up into adulthood to see that those two things were actually separate and influencing how I thought about my own culture. So like when I go overseas, part of the exercise is, how do I tease out what things my prejudices are about a particular culture? Is what they're doing genuinely something that is out of sync with loving their neighbor and loving God? Or is it something that I'm just not comfortable with because I'm thinking of all these different examples. All these different things that I've just adopted because I live in a culture where it is, you don't dance when Christians don't dance, and they just, I guess, are joyless, it seems like, in retrospect. Or like, people wear clothes all the time. Like that's something that's, important in our culture. And
that's another funny one. By the way, I've thought about this because I thought a lot of the real, like, documentaries and whatnot, like you see one of the big things the Westerners brought was like full on clothing.
Totally.
And it seems like the biblical problem is lust. And I'm going, I don't think any of these tribes, where the women didn't wear tops, were the men walking around going, whoa, look at those. I think they weren't, because that was the norm. And we didn't get to the people who went in there didn't get to the heart of the question of what causes lust. It might have been the paint in which you dressed yourself for the celebration that caused lust, and we didn't look deep enough. We just went, here's our Western solution for lust.
Yeah,
here
put on clothes.
Put on clothes,
and worked really well for us, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Well, yeah. Two examples as you say that. So when I lived in Cameroon, so this was around when I was 11 and when I was like 15. I remember we had a market outside the village we lived in, and every Friday, people from the big city would bring in their wares and kind of line them up. And this one guy lined up pictures that were like pornographic, and of like topless women, and then he lined up pictures of Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee, and no one cared about the topless people. They were all gathered around the Bruce Lee picture, and they were all like kicking each other and karate chopping and stuff. And like, I remember being fascinated by that. And then on similar note, kind of to what you're talking about, and what a culture perceives as sin as well. So I remember going and visiting people in their houses, and then like, everyone's got babies running around, and then I remember there was a time where all the babies kind of came up, and all the moms just like whipped all their tops off and started like breastfeeding their babies. And as an 11-year-old, I was like, oh my gosh, like that's wild. I'm gonna just look at the sky and not look at any human being and just like focus away. However, everyone had their ankles covered. Because if you exposed a certain portion of your leg, that was like a big deal.
Yep.
Whereas for us, it was like, yeah, you can wear like shorts and that's fine. But like if you wore shorts, even for an 11, 12, 13-year-old, if I wore shorts, for a guy, they'd look at you and be like, well, you're not a man. Adults wear pants. And then for a woman in that culture, it was like if you wore shorts, it was you could be a little girl and do that. But if you're an adult and you did that, that was like really taboo. So once again, it's one of those things of like, you have to know the culture you're going into and distinguish what am I bringing in from my own culture. And when I go down to the bare bones of Scripture and how do I love God and how do I love others, what actually is falling into that and out of that. So.
Right. And if the goal is to not, like, let's say, like, lust after someone in your heart, or for there to be adultery or whatever, the question would be, what leads to that here? So if there's always kind of a forbidden fruit question. And so I suppose if some of those women showed their ankles, that might have been a troublesome thing, right? And so then if that's causing the trouble in their heart, we need to respect that.
Right.
And I feel like it's not too much engagement. It's not enough that leads to some of these problems.
Totally.
It's not going deep enough. And so for those who would say, you shouldn't engage at all, it would be, well, then how are we ever going to do cross-cultural work?
Yeah.
What we have to do is we have to go deep. We have to understand. We have to really know a culture, and that takes work, and that'll take some fumbling along. Now, so that's like the response to somebody who'd say the colonialist, yada yada yada.
Yeah.
But now to the me, the person that read it and went, hold on, come on, like just in my gut reaction was like, she probably didn't mean to do any harm. She was trying to help. She's a good Christian girl who went over there to help. And I'm sure there's a lot of people, and I've a lot of people I think commented or thought, well, some of those kids were going to die anyway. At least she tried. At least she saved some. So respond to maybe as a medical professional, especially, and a Christian. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. So from a medical perspective, it's interesting because as I'm like reading the article, and they're like, you shouldn't do XYZ without a trained medical professional there. If there are different categories for how you think about how you're going to intervene in an emergency situation, so everything from triage protocol. So if there was a bomb that went off, how do you treat people? And if I'm not going to be able to save everyone, some people have the attitude, if you can't save everyone, you shouldn't do anything. Well, I'm just going to let people die. So there's all this. So from triage protocol to emergency room protocol to inpatient protocol and different things. So, and putting myself into the position as I'm reading the article, what would I do? And one of the things that actually came to my mind as I was reading it was part of it is, and I experienced this in the ER, is that there's compared to, talking to doctors from 30 or 40 years ago, the respect that people have for the education that goes into medicine is deteriorating.
Right.
So I'll have conversations with people and for instance, don't get me started on the vaccine stuff.
Right.
If I have conversations with people and I'm okay, well, this is what this treatment is going to do. And they're well, I Googled this, and your Google is not equal to my 10 plus years of advanced postdoctorate degree study. That's not the same thing.
Which is what people are frustrated about with this.
Totally.
But some of the same folks might be Googling other things and saying medical professionals are,
because that was the extent
bogus.
of this lady's medical experience, right? She was just Googling.
She mentioned Google.
Things.
Yeah.
Well, we don't. I guess I don't know I don't think there was experience. There was experience in working alongside potential medical professionals in her organization. There was that.
Right.
She probably learned some stuff from that, but then she was on her own a lot. It seemed, and from her report, she Googled stuff to try to figure it out. Then called her nurse friend.
Yeah. Well, my point is that I think that there's currently a milieu that as long as I can look stuff up, I can know the exact same things, and so I can go and
this you're saying
something.
Is culture wide. This isn't. This might be worldwide.
Totally.
Because of the amount of information available.
Right. Yeah. Because technically, going through medical school, when you don't know something, you Google it. Anyone can have access to all this information, and so there's a misleading in that you can. This kind of gives you a false sense of safety that I can look the stuff up and I can do kind of the same stuff and I'll be okay, because what really do doctors know? Because they're wrong all the time about all this other stuff.
Right.
So attitudes like that I think can give someone the ability to, instead of saying, wow, people that studied for a really long time are the ones that should be doing this because this is really complicated stuff. Maybe in the past they would be more likely to say that as compared to now.
Agreed.
And that's just anecdotal from my experience. So I think that was one thing I got from the article. Yeah.
I think that's in all the professions is happening,
totally.
but in a very profoundly dangerous way when it comes to health.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because I would imagine because I could Google, these are my symptoms, et cetera, but I feel like there's a lot of context that all of these things are going to fit into that only a doctor could discern that I really couldn't
and
do
the thing that
myself.
would happen next if I were to mistreat,
Right.
and then how to respond, that, all that sort of stuff too. Yeah.
Right. And then I briefly rambled on about this before the podcast started. So the phosphate stuff.
Right.
So unless you know that. So that's the thing that kind of is analogous to Chernobyl, was in my opinion, was that, like, so if you starve someone, they don't have a lot of phosphate in their blood, and then you give them food, and then they try and take the phosphate that's in their blood and incorporate it into, like, these molecules to make energy. I'm like, so you can actually, when you refeed someone, if you do it too quickly or too much and all the stuff that goes into it, if you don't know what you're doing and you don't know how to monitor it, you can make their malnutrition worse and kill them. Right. And that's probably what's going on with, like, a lot of the subset of these kids that were dying early on with the treatment. So if you don't know what labs to order, how to interpret the labs, and that's a big deal that I've found. So now a lot of patients are getting access to, like, being able to see their labs, which in one way is good. You should have access to your medical information. But if you don't know how to interpret data, you can do all sorts of stuff with data.
Right.
And so you need to be able to interpret the labs, know what labs to order, and then know how to intervene on the findings that you interpret. And, like, that is not something you get from WebMD.
Because, like, correct me if I'm wrong, my most medical experience is usually, like, Scrubs and, like, watching a couple seasons of...
Have you seen House?
House? Yeah, I did watch all of House. A little Grey's Anatomy with my mom back before it was good, right before George died.
Well, then that's... Yeah.
I listened to my wife's side of the family talking, and what tends to happen is I just get completely overwhelmed. But I go, it sure sounds like you all know what you're talking about.
But I feel like
I hope so.
With a lot of cases, like, even something fairly routine, there's a number of, like, it's not just one doctor who's handling things. There's a lot of specialists who are running their own, screenings and labs and interpreting this and that. So even if she was, like, let's say a licensed doctor, like, that doesn't mean that she'd still be capable of fully caring.
She
for
might not be
things.
acting out of her specialty.
Right.
And so even then, it would be the ideal thing, especially in an organization that's been around this long, would have been to have developed a diverse team of specialists who were working together, and they didn't even ever get to the point of having a specialist. There's obviously, in the missions conversation world, there's interesting stuff here about denominations and connectivity and responsibility and funding things that don't have oversight, and there's all sorts of stuff. And I think I would want to say, look, there are Christians who are engaging in really well overseen and organized work, in which they're doing things that have saved so many lives because of the great work. And then, there are people through the Christian faith and a sense that God said so, which is kind of what this girl's or lady's initial push to do it were, that don't have that kind of oversight, and people are sending them money because it's a sweet story, and both are happening. And so, like you said, with throwing the baby out with the bathwater, you got to be careful with that. But I think we as a Christian community need to own that we have been careless.
Totally.
And I think other people need to see too that we've also, as a Christian community, really done some awesome work.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of it has to go with the kind of the balance of knowledge versus wisdom. Like, this girl may have Google and get, she may have access to knowledge, but she doesn't have wisdom with how to apply the knowledge.
Right.
And so the same thing in terms of just missiology. Like, what are you doing my big thing nowadays is short-term missions, which is super precarious.
Yep.
Because you can totally do that poorly. And I've seen it done really poorly, and I've seen it done really well.
Yep. And
that comes from just, collectively years of experience going to different cultures and doing this stuff. Not like comparatively to if I took 10 people from the street, I probably know more about that kind of stuff than the average person, but I'm not an expert. But it comes from just having seen the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of how to do short-term missions and long-term missions.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But I think it's just something that needs to be talked about. It's something missions in general, we have our mandate, we know what we're supposed to do, but that's knowledge. How you actually do it is wisdom. So.
Yeah, I remember when I first took, back in the day, the Perspectives class, which I know you like.
Yeah.
And learned the amount of years and years and years of preparation that some folks are putting in, even just to enter a culture, the years of work just to do that, and then and then entering in. Now it's time to learn these people and their particular set of situations, and a lot of the best ones is a work of a lifetime.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that happened in maybe the 80s and 90s and kind of the explosion of the missions movement is people wanted to jump in and do something cool and skip all that.
Totally.
And what I'm glad for the microscope that's come out so that we can pare that down, but I also don't want to see us abandon the missionary cause.
Yeah. I think another one of those stereotypes that I kind of mentioned earlier is that it's like, I think it was even mentioned in the NPR article where it's like, a college kid who wants to travel just goes on missions. Like they, hey, you want to spend a summer in Croatia? Hey, come out here, hang out with a church, build a, school, and then fly back and nothing.
Have great mushy feelings.
And there's been a ton of that, and a lot of my friends and I had those feelings too, frankly. Like, and I'm looking back at that and going, ooh, not good.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that some people haven't really put in the work and applied wisdom and done a great job.
Yeah. And I've seen some people do, like, I don't know how in-depth their research is, but some people studied it and, like, so one of the arguments for like short-term missions is like, okay, you bring people over, exposure, and then they consider long-term missions, and they've kind of like studied that a little bit, and some people have said like, well, maybe it actually doesn't really pan out. Like the amount of people that go over doesn't equal the amount of, like, your investment in the front end doesn't equal your return in the back end. However, but on like the flip side of that, so I had a girl that went with me to China for a trip. And she had never really done anything like that before. And this is post perspectives as well. So, like, my thoughts as I'm bringing people on the short-term trip is, what are they going to do with this after the trip is done? And that really needs to be on the forefront of your mind when you're doing this. And we kind of focused on that on the trip. Like, what we're doing now is good, and we're needed by the people who are here long-term. So we know we're in the right context. So when we go back, what are we actually going to do with this? And then we kind of focus on that. And I remember when the trip was done, she was like, oh my gosh, like, this is actually important stuff. And she's not overseas right now, but she is now a campus missionary, and like took what she had gotten from that and took it into becoming a campus ministry leader. And then she herself has done all these different trips now through her campus. And then people that she's taken on that trip they are full-time overseas in these different cultures doing all this stuff. And it's really cool to be able to be like, okay, I did one short-term trip. And if you're focusing on the well-being of the people that are on the trip spiritually, and you're doing this in the right context, I really have seen like multiplicative effects from that. Like, these guys are in places that I've never been in my life and probably will never go. So I think, yes, there's a lot of downsides to doing, and I totally have been in that camp of like, I want to go do something good for a week, and then we're going to like go across the border, and we're going to paint faces and kick around a soccer ball and sing some songs. We're going to smile, and we're going to like which loving children is beautiful. Like, I'm a pediatrician. Like, I think it's great. Children are awesome. However, then all of a sudden they pack up on the bus and they wave goodbye, and then like, what's going to happen to these people?
I was on the email list for, I don't know if I probably should name this organization because
just call it
out.
No.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
Call it something else is what I was going to say.
I mean, it's kind of condemning already because the nature of it. If anyone who knows it, they'll know exactly as soon as I describe it. But it's the one where you basically spend like a week in one place and then you hop to the next place and you go around the world in like 9 months or something. I clicked remove or unsubscribe about 8 times, and they kept sending me emails. And like
they've got like 20 lists they put you on that first time. You got to get off all the lists. It. The San Francisco Giants did that to me too. I can't get rid of them. When I go to one game, I can't get rid of them.
Can't shake them off. Yeah, they just really want me to go.
So that's terrible.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you go?
No, I didn't. But
okay.
I was in a campus ministry where they came to give their little talk, and they had some of their staffers come and explain how great it was. And I think I knew somebody who did end up going.
I've known a few people that did that. Yeah. It sounds super appealing.
Same.
It sounds fun.
It's like if you want to be a super Christian and you kind of want to be on a reality TV show, it's sort of like getting the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
And it sounds pretty dirty and disgusting when you think of it that way. But
Yeah.
We had a guest speaker at seminary last year who was a missionary from Brazil who would do a lot of missions work with like the indigenous tribes there and whatnot. And he had a quote that really stuck out to me where somebody asked him what the most frustrating thing about missionaries, specifically from the West, like what the most frustrating thing about these missionaries are. And he said, they're really good at answering questions that nobody's asking.
Cool.
And
Wow.
that quote is so
Man.
just phenomenal because it's true. Like, this is the spirit of that like colonial imperialistic like missions that we're trying so hard to resist. It's I'm gonna show up, I'm gonna tell you really what you should care about, and I'm not going to try to conform or blend in or adapt with your culture at all. I'm gonna tell you what's what. I'm gonna build you a hospital. And then I'm gonna bounce in 6 weeks.
Totally.
And I love that there are people who are really taking missions like a lot more seriously than that, and just not disrespecting people by just showing up in their land and telling them what to do.
Yeah, and that's one thing that So if to explain how my approach is to like long-term missions versus short-term missions in like a cheap sentence, it is really the long-term missionaries are the people focusing on how do I love this culture. And then the short-term missionaries really need to be focusing on how do I support the long-term missionaries.
Yeah.
And so, like,
Agreed.
a lot of long-term missionaries that I know, if you talk to them about short-termers, they just, like, roll their eyes and grumble, and they're like, like, they don't really like them because they come in, they have to babysit them the whole time.
It takes a lot more work to deal with them.
And resources, too.
Yeah, and
you've got to feed them, you've got to housing and all that.
When the short-termers leave, the long-termers often are like, okay, now I can actually get back to the work that I'm doing.
And I have to like take a week off to recover from that.
Yeah, totally.
And the short-termers go home going like, that was awesome.
Yeah, I went and I just had such a great experience. My heart's just touched, and I know.
I feel like Moses.
I'm gonna blog.
Yeah, I'm gonna blog about it. And it's gonna be great.
Got this glow about my face. Like, ah, man.
I'm just broken. I'm just so broken right now. Yeah, just Jesus did a lot of good stuff in me, so now I'm gonna keep going and just marry someone rich. I don't know who this person is in my head that's talking, but
now that we've thoroughly insulted them, it's probably time to just end this podcast before it gets worse. And we've had a solid amount of time talking.
Should we do a quick shout out to the people who use their Facebook profile pictures with a bunch of African kids too?
Dude, I have one of those.
Oh no! Oh no! I'm sorry, James.
But don't worry, I was there supporting the long-termers.
Oh, there we go.
It's okay if I do
as long
that.
as you're doing it right, you can post whatever pictures you want.
Totally. No, it was good.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. I hope this was helpful. James, thanks for being on. And John,
I loved it. It was fun.
Of course.
Eric, like to say that we missed you, but I forgot you weren't here, man. And just these guys are so great. Wish you could have been here with us for real. Though. So thanks, and we'll talk to you next time.
All right.